Imagine a world with no printers, no computers, no photocopiers, no phones. If you wanted a copy of something, you couldn't just press a button. Yes. If you wanted to send a message, you couldn't just type it out. Every single word that needed to exist on a page had to be put there by a human hand. Every book, every law, every business contract, every king's decree, every love letter. It all had to be written out, one letter at a time. In that world, the people who did the writing were essential. They were the scriveners. A scrivener was a professional writer. It sounds simple, but their role was fundamental to how medieval society worked. They were the information technology of their age. Without them, commerce would grind to a halt. Governments couldn't issue commands or keep records. The church couldn't create the Bibles and prayer books it needed. Knowledge itself could barely be passed down. Their job was to write, and in doing so, they held the machinery of civilization together. There were two main kinds of scriveners, especially in the early medieval period. The first kind worked in monasteries. These were monks, and for them, writing was a form of worship. They worked in a special room called a scriptorium. It was often cold and quiet. Their main task was to copy religious texts. They copied the Bible, books of Psalms, and the writings of church fathers. This work was slow and deliberate. It wasn't just about getting the words down, it was about creating a beautiful object for the glory of God. These monastic scribes were incredibly important. They preserved knowledge through the chaos of the Dark Ages. When the Roman Empire fell, much of the classical learning of Greece and Rome could have been lost forever. But monks in isolated monasteries in places like Ireland and England painstakingly copied these texts. They copied Christian works, but also classical philosophy, science, and literature. They didn't always understand what they were copying, but they preserved it. The books we have today from that era exist because a monk sat in a quiet room day after day and copied them by hand. But as the Middle Ages went on, society changed. Towns and cities grew. Trade expanded. Universities were founded. A new world of business, law, and learning emerged outside the monastery walls. And this new world needed writers. This led to the rise of the second kind of scrivener, the professional secular scrivener. These were not monks. They were business people. They set up shop in the busy parts of town, often near a cathedral, a courthouse, or a university. They worked for anyone who could pay. Their work was incredibly varied. A merchant might need a scrivener to draw up a contract for a shipment of wool. A nobleman might need copies of a deed to prove he owned his land. A student at a new university needed a copy of a textbook on philosophy or medicine. And many people, even wealthy ones, could not read or write. If they needed to send a letter, they would go to a scrivener. They would dictate the letter, and the scrivener would write it down. The scrivener became the voice for the illiterate. These scriveners were part of the growing middle class of craftsmen and merchants. They formed guilds like the Scriveners' Company of London. These guilds set standards for their work, trained apprentices, and controlled who could practice the trade. Being a scrivener was a respectable profession. It required years of training to develop a clear, fast, and consistent handwriting. It also required literacy, a skill that was far from universal. Many scriveners also needed to know multiple languages. In England, for example, a scrivener might need to write in Latin for the church, French for the law courts, and English for everyday business. So a scrivener wasn't just a copyist, they were the bridge between the spoken word and the written record. They gave permanence to agreements, laws, and ideas. In a world where memory was fallible and a person's word could be disputed, the written document was a powerful thing. And the scrivener was the one who created it. They were the quiet, essential workers who made the medieval world run. Their pens were the engines of government, commerce, and culture. A scrivener's work was a physical craft. It depended entirely on their tools and materials, and those tools were nothing like the smooth pens and bright white paper we have today. Everything was organic, handmade, and often difficult to work with. The entire process, from preparing the page to making the ink, was a form of artistry and labor. Understanding their tools helps us understand the world they worked in. The first thing a scrivener needed was something to write on. For most of the Middle Ages, that wasn't paper. It was parchment or vellum. Both were made from animal skin. Parchment was typically made from the skin of a sheep or a goat. Vellum, the higher quality material, was made from the skin of a calf. The process of making it was long and smelly. The animal skin was first soaked in lime water to loosen the hair and fat. Then it was stretched tight on a wooden frame. While it was stretched, a worker would take a special curved knife and scrape it. They would scrape and scrape, removing all the hair from one side and any remaining flesh from the other. This process thinned the skin and made it smooth. After scraping, it was left to dry on the frame. The tension of the frame kept it from shrinking and wrinkling. Finally, the surface was dusted with chalk or pumice powder and rubbed to make it perfectly smooth and ready to accept ink. The result was a durable, creamy, and beautiful writing surface, but it was also incredibly expensive. A single large book, like a Bible, could require the skins of hundreds of animals. This is why medieval books were so precious. The material itself was a form of wealth. Paper did exist. It was invented in China and slowly made its way to Europe through the Arab world. By the later Middle Ages, paper mills were being built in Italy and France. Paper was cheaper, but it was also seen as less permanent. For important documents like laws, deeds, or religious books, parchment and vellum were still preferred. Next came the pen. The medieval pen was a quill, made from the flight feather of a large bird, usually a goose. The swan feathers were prized for fine work, and crow feathers were used for the thinnest lines. A scrivener would get a handful of these feathers and prepare them. First, they were hardened by being heated in hot sand. This made them less brittle. Then, the most important step, the scrivener had to cut the point. This was a true skill, known as cutting a quill. Using a small, sharp knife called a penknife, they would carve the end of the feather into a nib. They had to slice it at an angle, split the very tip to create a channel for the ink, and trim it to the exact width they needed for their script. A quill was not a permanent tool. The point wore down quickly on the slightly abrasive surface of the parchment. A scrivener would have to recut their quill constantly, maybe every few pages. The penknife was always on their desk, not just for sharpening the pen, but also for scraping away mistakes. If the scrivener made an error, they could carefully use the sharp edge of the knife to scrape the ink off the surface of the parchment before writing over it. And then there was the ink. Medieval ink was made by hand from natural ingredients. The most common type was iron gall ink. It was made from a strange ingredient, oak galls. Oak galls are round growths that form on oak trees when a wasp lays its eggs in the bark. These galls are rich in a chemical called tannic acid. To make ink, the galls were crushed and soaked in water or wine. Then iron sulfate, a chemical compound then called vitriol, was added. A chemical reaction occurred, producing a dark liquid. Finally, a binder like gum arabic, a type of tree sap, was stirred in to help the ink stick to the page and flow smoothly from the quill. Iron gall ink was very permanent. It actually bonded with the parchment, but it was also acidic and could, over centuries, eat through the page. Another type of ink was carbon ink, made from soot or charcoal, mixed with a binder. This ink was less corrosive, but it sat on the surface of the page and could be smudged or washed off more easily. Scriveners also used colored inks for titles, special letters, or illustrations. Red was common, made from minerals like cinnabar or from insects. Blue was often made from the expensive lapis lazuli stone ground into a fine powder. The scrivener's workspace was simple. They worked at a slanted desk, designed to make the long hours of writing more comfortable. They would have their pot of ink, their penknife, their quills, and a piece of lead or a plummet to rule faint, straight lines on the page to keep their writing even. They used weights to hold the page flat. The work was done in natural light, often by a window, as candles and lamps were a fire hazard around so many flammable materials. It was quiet, focused, and physically demanding work. It required a steady hand, a strong back, and good eyesight, all of which could fade with time in the dim light and cold rooms of the medieval world. The daily life of a scrivener depended greatly on where they worked. A monk in a monastery scriptorium had a very different existence from a commercial writer hustling for business in a busy London street. But both shared a life dominated by the rhythm of writing, the demands of their materials, and the strain of long, focused hours. Let's first imagine the life of a monk in a scriptorium. His day was structured by the church. He would wake before dawn for prayers, and his work in the scriptorium would fit between the daily cycle of religious services. The scriptorium was supposed to be a place of silence. Communication was often done through a set of gestures. This silence was meant to encourage a state of prayerful contemplation. The work of copying the word of God was a sacred duty. The abbot, or a senior monk, would assign the work. One monk might be tasked with copying a book of the Bible, another a collection of sermons. They would work at their individual desks or carrels. The light would come from the windows, so work stopped when the sun went down. The rooms were often unheated to reduce the risk of fire. In the winter, this meant working in the biting cold. We have notes from monks in the margins of manuscripts complaining about the cold, the bad light, and the poor quality of the parchment. The work was methodical. Before starting, the monk would rule his page with a lead point, creating faint guidelines for the text. Then he would begin to copy, looking back and forth between the original book, called the exemplar, and his own blank page. He had to be careful not to introduce errors. The goal was a perfect, faithful copy. Sometimes the scriptorium worked like an assembly line. One monk would copy the main text in black ink. He would leave spaces for the large, decorated initial letters and the titles. Another monk, called a rubricator, would come in later and add the titles and initials in red ink. An even more specialized artist, an illuminator, might then add gold leaf and intricate paintings to the pages. This collaborative process could take months or even years to produce a single beautiful book. Now, let's picture the world of the commercial scrivener. His shop might be a small stall, open to the street in a city like Paris or Oxford. He was a small businessman. He had to attract customers. His reputation for good, fast, and accurate work was his most valuable asset. His day wasn't structured by prayers, but by the needs of his clients. A day could be incredibly varied. In the morning, a baker might come in needing a receipt written for a large order of flour. The scrivener would quickly write it out on a scrap of parchment or paper. An hour later, a lawyer's clerk might arrive with a complex property deed that needed to be copied perfectly, with no mistakes, before the court session that afternoon. This required great concentration and a knowledge of legal formulas. Around midday, a young woman might shyly approach the stall. She cannot write, but she wants to send a letter to a merchant she is supposed to marry in another town. She would dictate her thoughts and feelings, and the scrivener would have to capture her voice on the page, writing down her words of affection or concern. This required not just writing skill, but a certain social sensitivity. After that, a university student might drop off a well-worn copy of a book by Aristotle, asking for a new copy to be made. This was a long-term, profitable project, but the student would likely haggle over the price per page. The commercial scrivener was paid for his work, often by the page or even by the word. This created pressure to work quickly, but speed could lead to errors, and a sloppy document could ruin his reputation. He had to balance speed and accuracy. He also had to manage his materials. Parchment and ink cost money. He couldn't afford to waste them. Unlike the monk, who was provided for by the monastery, the city scrivener had to run a profitable business to feed his family. He was part of a network of artisans. He might buy his parchment from a parchment maker down the street, his ink from an apothecary, and his quills from a poulterer. He might also work with illuminators if a wealthy client wanted a decorated book of poetry or a fancy charter. His life was embedded in the noisy, competitive, and dynamic world of the medieval city. Whether in the silent scriptorium or the bustling street, the scrivener's day was one of intense focus. It was a life spent bent over a desk, translating the sounds and needs of the world into the silent, permanent marks of the written word. It is easy to think of a medieval scrivener as a human photocopier, just a hand that moved, mindlessly duplicating text. But that is not the whole picture. The work required a sharp mind, deep knowledge, and a range of skills that went far beyond just forming letters. The scrivener was often an editor, a linguist, a legal expert, and a scholar. The mind behind the hand was just as important as the hand itself. First, there was the matter of language. A scrivener in a place like England couldn't just know English. The most important documents were written in other languages. The church operated almost entirely in Latin. The Bible, theological works, and internal church communications were all in Latin. A scrivener working for a bishop or a monastery had to be fluent. They needed to understand complex grammar and a specialized vocabulary. The law courts and the royal government often used the form of French, called Anglo-Norman, for centuries after the Norman conquest. So a scrivener who wanted to work in the legal profession had to master this language as well. They'd be able to draft rights, charters, and court records in a precise legal French. Then, for everyday business, for personal letters, and for the growing body of popular literature like the Canterbury Tales, they would use the local vernacular, such as Middle English. A good professional scrivener was therefore often trilingual. They could switch between languages depending on the job. This required a significant education. Beyond just knowing the languages, scriveners had to understand the content of what they were writing. This was especially true for those who specialized in legal documents. They weren't just copying words, they were drafting contracts. A client would come to them and say, "I want to sell this piece of land to my neighbor." The scrivener had to know the correct legal formula to make that sale official and binding. They had to include the right phrases, the names of the witnesses, the date, and the description of the property. They were, in effect, acting as lay lawyers. In some parts of Europe, this role evolved into the profession of the notary public. A notary was a scrivener who was given authority by the Pope or the Emperor to create and authenticate documents. Their signature and seal made a document legally valid. While this formal system was less common in England, the function of the English scrivener was often very similar. They were the trusted professionals who turned spoken agreements into legally sound written records. Their work prevented disputes and formed the bedrock of legal and commercial life. The scriveners also acted as editors and critics. When they copied a book, they were rarely passive. They were often the first readers of a text. If they came across a word they thought was a mistake in the original copy, they might correct it. Sometimes their correction was right, other times they introduced a new error based on a misunderstanding. They might also update the spelling or grammar of an older text to make it more readable for their audience. Sometimes we get a glimpse of their personality. In the margins of manuscripts, scriveners would occasionally write their own comments, called colophons. These were notes made outside the main text. A scrivener might complain about his hand aching or the poor quality of the ink. One famous note at the end of a book reads, "As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe." They might make a joke, criticize the text they were copying, or simply write the end, "Thank God." These small notes are precious because they remind us that these were real people, with feelings and opinions, not just mindless machines. The professionalization of the trade-through guilds also shows the intellectual side of their work. The Scriveners' Company of London, for example, had strict rules. To become a master scrivener, an apprentice had to prove his skills not just in handwriting, but in drafting documents in Latin, French, and English. They were tested on their knowledge of legal forms. The guild ensured that a client who hired a member of the company was getting a true expert, not just someone with neat handwriting. The scrivener was a knowledge worker in a world where knowledge was rare and powerful. They organized and recorded information, making them one of the most intellectually vital professions of the Middle Ages. For centuries, the world of the scrivener was stable. The demand for written material only grew, and their skills were always needed. A good scrivener could expect a lifetime of steady work. But in the middle of the 15th century, in a workshop in Mons, Germany, a man named Johannes Gutenberg perfected a new invention. It was the printing press with movable type, and it would change the world forever. For the scrivener, it was the beginning of the end. The arrival of the printing press was not a sudden shock. It was a slow-moving revolution. The first printed books were expensive, and printers tried to make them look as much like manuscripts as possible. They used typefaces that imitated the handwriting of scriveners. They left spaces for illuminators to come in and add decorated initials by hand. For a while, the two technologies existed side by side. Some wealthy nobles and church leaders even looked down on printed books. They saw them as cheap mechanical imitations of the real thing. A handwritten manuscript remained a luxury item, a status symbol that showed you could afford to pay for months of a craftsman's labor. But the advantages of the press were undeniable. A team of scriveners might take a year to produce one copy of the Bible. A printing press could produce hundreds of copies in the same amount of time, and each copy was identical. There was no risk of a sleepy scribe making an error and having that error repeated in all future copies. The cost of books began to fall dramatically. Knowledge that had been locked away in monasteries or in the libraries of the very rich was now available to a much wider audience. The scriveners had different reactions to this new technology. Some saw it as a grave threat to their livelihood and fought against it. Guilds of scriveners in cities like Paris tried to lobby the authorities to ban or restrict the new printing presses. They argued that printing would destroy their ancient and honorable craft. For a time they might have succeeded in slowing its spread, but they could not stop it. The demand for cheap books was too great. Other scriveners were more pragmatic. They adapted. They realized that the new printing industry created new kinds of work. A printer needed an accurate, clean copy of a text to set his type from. A skilled scrivener could find work preparing these master copies. After a book was printed, it needed to be checked for errors. Many scriveners became the first proofreaders, using their sharp eyes to catch mistakes in the printed pages. Some went even further. They embraced the new technology completely. They used their knowledge of the book trade to become booksellers, publishers, or even printers themselves. William Caxton, the man who brought the printing press to England, came from the world of the London merchants and had a deep understanding of the manuscript trade he was about to disrupt. But for the core work of the scrivener, book copying, the decline was inevitable. By the early 1500s, the trade of the manuscript book copyist was fading fast. It became a niche market for luxury goods, not the main way books were produced. However, not all of the scrivener's work disappeared. The printing press was good for producing many copies of the same thing. It was not efficient for creating unique, one-off documents. The work of the legal scrivener, therefore, continued for much longer. Contracts, wills, deeds, and court records still needed to be written out by hand. There was a tradition of using handwritten documents for legal matters. There were also concerns about the potential for printed legal forms to be forged. So, the scrivener who had specialized in law found that his skills were still in demand. This branch of the profession evolved into the modern roles of the clerk, the notary, and the legal secretary. The legacy of the medieval scrivener is immense. It exists in the thousands of beautiful manuscripts that survive in museums and libraries around the world. These books are not just collections of words, they are works of art, testament to the skill and dedication of the hands that made them. But their legacy is also invisible. It is in the very survival of the knowledge they copied. They were the human bridge that carried the literature, science, and philosophy of the ancient world across the chasm of the Dark Ages. They built the documentary foundations of our legal and commercial systems. They did their work quietly, in cold rooms and busy streets with goose feathers and boiled tree galls. And in doing so, they wrote the world we now inhabit.